like at this point, 90% of the research I do regarding veiling is just me trying to find new styles that will actually look good on camera. Hello everyone! Welcome to another episode of Magical Tea Time. Today I am drinking a nice vanilla almond tea, I think from the Republic of Tea, because I have access to my mother's tea stash right now, in this fun little cottage mug. So yeah, there's that part of the Magical Tea Time. And today's video is about altars. Now this is a video that has been decently requested, so I hope you all enjoy it. This is a subject that I find incredibly interesting to research on and just in general to talk about, because within the witchcraft community there tends to be two different definitions of altars that I see and two different uses for them. So I'm excited to dive into that today. Now I hear some of you asking, Lizzie, what is an altar? Simply put, an altar is sort of a designated space, a space that is set apart for a certain purpose. There are two main uses of altars that I see, and sometimes they're combined and sometimes they're separate. I personally keep these separate, but a lot of people combine them. Both options are great. The two varieties that I tend to see are altars for witchcraft and altars for deity worship. The altars for witchcraft are very personalized. They are for your practice. That is a space that is specifically set aside for you to be doing witchcraft and rituals, and for you to store supplies if you want to, and basically just do whatever you want. But it is a space specifically set aside for your witchcraft, for your practice. The altars that are made for deities are a little bit different. Those are specifically a space set aside for your worship or working with that specific deity. Sometimes multiple deities. You can put multiple deities in the same space. And those are decorated with things that represent the deity, with offerings for the deity, with some sort of, usually some sort of vessel for offerings, and very frequently, especially within the witchcraft and working with sphere, a candle as an offering. Now, the witchcraft altar is typically what people tend to be referring to as an altar within the online witchcraft sphere. Again, it is a space that is specifically set aside for spell work. It is not, however, necessary for spell work. You do not need to have an altar of any variety or a permanent altar of any variety for spell work. It's not a requirement. It can be nice to have it, but it's not a requirement. It's something that is just generally nice to have. But you can absolutely do spell work without an altar, especially if you are in a living situation where you cannot necessarily have an out and proud altar. It is absolutely okay to not have an altar to be practicing witchcraft. So yeah, it is a space set aside for your practice. It can have tools for rituals. It can have, very often, a fireproof dish. I love fireproof dishes. Highly recommend having a fireproof dish on your altar, especially if you do a lot of work with candles. It might have candles on it, and generally they tend to have things that are fairly representative of your practice. If someone, for example, is really into crystals and using crystals in their witchcraft, they might have a lot of beautiful crystal towers and carved pieces. I have a piece of, I believe it's onyx, that is carved like a little cat. I haven't put it on my altar, and I will get to why that is, but I love it. It's great. I love carved little crystal things. They're so fun. Or if someone is, for example, really into green witchcraft, they might have a lot of their herb bottles sitting on their altar. They might have some sort of ritual use shears for harvesting herbs. They might have plant pots. They might have their altar set on a windowsill so that they can get the maximum amount of light for those plants. Your practice is going to shape your altar a lot of the time. It doesn't have to, but it very frequently does. And witchcraft altars are, again, very personalized, and that is why they often do reflect your craft, because your craft is very personal to you. If you have, for example, if you have a very more ceremonial path, you might have a lot of those tools on your altar. You might have your ritual clothes and your ritual veil, if you have one of those, tucked underneath your veil or stored in some part of it. But overall, it's very much going to reflect you and your practice. And if you have something on your altar that is just sitting there because someone somewhere told you that it should go on your altar, but you don't personally feel like it should be there, take it off. It doesn't have to be there. Your altar should have things that you want to have on it. Now, deity altars, also often referred to as shrines, which can be an easier way to set the two apart, they're different than the witchcraft altars, unless of course you have a combined setup, which is very chill. Love those. But those are very frequently going to have like maybe a representation of the deity, a photograph, a painting, a statue. It'll have things that represent that deity in other ways, their epithets. Something like, if you're a Hestia devotee, you may have representations of fire. I have a little painting for Hestia that I did of fire in a bowl. If you worship Apollo or Apollon, you might have something like a crow on your altar. You might have a musical instrument if it's a bigger altar, or you might have what I have, which is a harmonica on Apollo's altar. I have a harmonica on Apollo's altar. And also, I have a little bird that a friend of mine made for a project. It's great, and I love it so much, and every time that I see that on his altar, it brings me so much joy, and I can tell it brings him joy, because immediately after she made that, a package that she got arrived with extra things in it that she did not pay for, and they did not make her take it back. So, thanks Apollo. Love that. But you may have little fun little offering things on the altar to represent that deity, offerings to that deity. If you have, say, permanent non-food, non-perishable offerings, those often just sit on the altar as part of it. They just become part of it after a while, things like crystals. And you may often on a deity altar have something like a dish for offerings or a cup for liquid offerings. You may have both, you may just have one. And very frequently, as I've established, candles. Candles are a very, very frequent thing on deity altars. Within the working sphere, I think it's a form of communication. Within the worship sphere, I know that it's usually as an offering. It's a more traditional offering in a lot of ways, and I appreciate doing those, especially, again, as I am a Hestia devotee. It makes sense to have a candle on her altar, because, you know, fire. But yeah, deity altars are going to be a little bit different in that way, because they focus a bit less on you and quite a bit more on the deity that you are working with or worshiping. I've also been asked a bit, how do you set up an altar? And again, how you set up an altar is going to depend heavily on what you need it for, and if it's an altar for witchcraft, then it's going to depend heavily on you and on your practice. Again, it will be very personalized. It's really just about having what you feel that you need on there and working with whatever space options you have. If you have a very small windowsill to work with, you might not want to have a lot of things on there, especially if it's a witchcraft altar. You might just want like a simple fireproof dish and maybe a couple of candle holders. Maybe put the candle holders on the dish now that I'm thinking about it, because a lot of windowsills are wooden. Maybe don't put the candles on the windowsill if it's wooden. I'm just thinking about that now. I've done that before, it can go badly. But it's going to depend heavily on the needs of the altar with how you set it up. And as we've established some basic elements of the deity altars, and again, that's going to depend heavily on who you are working with or worshiping as well. That will heavily impact the setup of the altar. And if it's a witchcraft altar, then your practice will heavily impact the setup of that. I've also been asked a decent bit if you need an altar to have a practice. No, you do not need an altar. You don't need an altar if you are worshiping a deity. You don't need an altar if you are practicing witchcraft. You don't need an altar for either thing. It can be nice to have, but it's not necessary. There are a lot of ways to do those workings and a lot of ways to do deity worship and to honor those deities without having an altar. You can do so much especially without a physical space, or without something that's like a big physical space. You don't need a ton of space to do these things. People have been practicing witchcraft and worshiping deities for generations, for thousands and thousands of years. You can work with so little, and it's great. Okay, so how do you maintain an altar if you really want one, but it's not really safe for you to necessarily be out in the open with your practice? I'm not talking about if it will bring you physical harm. Yet again, I'm going to put that disclaimer, just like I did with about practicing secretly. If it will put you at risk in terms of your safety, it's not worth it. You can wait. If it's worship, if it's deity worship that you're waiting to do, the gods will understand. I promise. They will understand if it's for your safety. If it's witchcraft, the witchcraft will still be there when you become an adult or you've gotten into a safer living situation. I promise. You don't have to do it if it will put a risk to your safety. If it will not put a risk to your safety, here are some ways to be secretive about it. A really great method that I've seen are shoebox altars. Those are a fairly small setup, but that still provides you with a little bit of space. You can do things like put a small piece of scrap fabric in the bottom as an altar cloth. You can fit a fairly small fireproof dish in there, but I wouldn't recommend doing anything that involves fire in a shoebox. Those are very flammable. Fire safety is important. I'm a Hestia devotee, for crying out loud. But you can do things like draw sigils on the lid. I'm bringing up sigils again. I love sigils so much. Could you tell? But yeah, you can draw sigils on the lid. You can decorate the inside of the shoebox. There are a lot of very easy ways to use it as a witchcraft altar. You can put very small representations of a deity. It's a very simple way to have a nice altar for a deity when you have limited space or when you need to keep things very hidden. It can also be stored under the bed, in a closet, in a drawer, behind a drawer. There are a lot of places you can put a shoebox. It's great. I love it. Another that's a much smaller version of this is the putting an altar in an Altoids tin. That gives you less options. You may have to deal with more printed out photos to represent things, but it can still absolutely work. I've done that before. It was mostly for on-the-go supplies, which is a lot of what travel altars tend to be, is on-the-go supplies, but it can still absolutely work, and it can work very well. You can put small little tumbled crystals in there. You can put incense cones in there. You can put matches in there. You can put a printed out photo of a deity. You can put out printed representations of that deity's epithets. There are a lot of options to work with just an Altoids tin. Something that I see that is very often slept upon are digital altars in various forms. There are Pinterest boards that you can use as altars. I've done that. That was a very easy way to keep my practice discreet in a lot of ways. You can do a collage. You can do a digital collage with like a photo editing app. That can be a great way to honor a deity when you can't have a physical space to represent them. There are ways to do altars in video games. We don't talk enough about altars in video games. You can build a whole temple in a video game, like Minecraft specifically. You can build a whole temple there if you wanted to. You can build a whole witchy-themed house. There's candles in Minecraft now. I love that so much. But you can do so much with digital formats. The internet's a great place for that kind of thing. If you want an altar and you can't have any kind of physical space for it, do a digital altar. There are so many great options. Oh, I love doing devotional things in Minecraft. I love creating the coziest little houses with these beautiful fireplaces. I'm just being like, Lady Hestia, are you happy with this cozy little house that I've created? And it's great. I love it. Digital altars. The sun is starting to show up. Apollo, are you happy with me right now? Are you appreciating this, or is it just the sun being normal? Who knows? But there are other ways to do very discrete altars in a physical form that, well, you know that it's an altar, many other people wouldn't. For example, you could have just a vase and a bowl sitting on a shelf somewhere, and you know that it's an altar, but nobody else knows it's an altar. It's all about intention with that. Just intent behind regular home decor. You can create a very discreet altar that way. People won't talk about that very much. There's also disassembled altars. That's what mine is at the moment, because I do not have a ton of space and I'm in the middle of cleaning my room very drastically, and also because there's a lot of moving back and forth with being on campus. I'm not back on campus yet, but when I am, there's a lot of moving back and forth. So what I've started doing is having a fireproof tray. I don't do the fire stuff at college. In case my RA sees this, I don't do that. I promise. I promised. I made a promise. You heard me make that promise. I do not, in fact, do the fire things at college, but it's also just nice because it's just metal and it's nice to do workings on metal. So that's what I tend to do. I just pull everything. You just can pull everything out of a box or out of a drawer, and boom, you have an altar that nobody else would realize is an altar. It's just a drawer of stuff. It's just your junk drawer. No, it's an altar. It's a disassembled altar, and then you put everything out, you do your stuff, you put it back in the drawer. I don't do a whole lot of very ceremonial workings, in case you couldn't tell. I mostly do just, I need a spell right now, and I'm gonna do all the stuff and do it, and yeah. I do things based off of need basis, and sometimes based off of a preventative basis, but it's mostly not ceremonial in any way. But yeah, disassembled altars are great. And also, putting everything in a drawer. You can just have an altar in a drawer, empty out a drawer, put everything in there. It's a pretty hidden space, unless somebody's going through your drawers. And if they're going through your drawers, then it may just be safer to not be practicing at that point, to keep everything and wait until you're in a safer environment where no one will be going through your drawers. So yeah, that is my video with some basic information on altars. Forgive me for it not being a little bit more thorough and in-depth, but I am doing my best. I put some resources in the description below. This is a reminder to future me to please put those resources in the description. You need to put them there. For those of you who want to do a little bit more research, a little bit more independent research. Again, double check your sources, double check everything. Cross-referencing is a beautiful thing to do on the internet. You don't trust people on the internet. Don't take them at their word, even if it's me. I make mistakes too. I do things wrong. It's not on purpose, but I do things wrong. So yeah. That's my video on altars. I hope you're all having a lovely time. I have zero regrets about this tea. It's really good. Have a great time, everyone.